This is Canon Fodder, episode 5. We are covering Legends of the Fall with I almost don't want to give him an intro because if you're listening to this, you know Lomez, but at the same time, he's the ultimate paper merchant in our sphere. He is the founder of Passage Press and the Passage Prize. He's a Twitter frog extraordinaire, and I'm lucky to call him my friend. So, hello, Lomez.
Sorry, yeah, I was muted there. TR, thanks for having me on, man. Yeah, feelings mutual. I'm glad we could have this conversation. I'm excited for this podcast in general. I think it's a great idea to have people on talking about their favorite authors and favorite books. I think this is going to be a fun conversation.
Most definitely. And we were talking a little bit before this, and you mentioned that you picked this book because you were trying to gauge what I would like. And I have to say, you hit the nail on the head. Just 10 out of 10. I am in love with this novella. It's so good.
That is really great to hear. You presented me initially with the option to, or suggestion that I pick my favorite book and we could talk about my favorite book. And I have to say that I'm very guarded about that. I almost like don't like talking about it. Those books, there's maybe a couple and I feel like almost they belong to me and I'm reluctant to share them with the world.
That's really
Or in any
interesting.
case, yeah, there's also this problem that there's art that I think, speaks to you kind of so intimately in such a raw way. And this is true of music. It's true of certain films. And certainly for me, it's true of a few books that I can think of and a couple that I'm actually staring at on my bookshelf right now that I don't actually want to talk about. It's not even that I don't want to share with people, but I wouldn't even know what to say. They kind of bring me to silence almost.
Mm.
And talking about them, trying to sort of analyze them or think too critically about them apart from just the experience of reading these books almost minimizes them in some way or is almost degrading or too crass. Like it's, taking something that's almost divine and trying to fit it into words, which can never quite provide the kind of explanation or summary or account of the reading experience that's merited. So anyway, this is a long-winded way of me saying I selected this book because I like it very, very much, and it had a dramatic impact on me when I first read it. But also, it's something I feel like we can talk about, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be gleaned from this book for young writers and certainly writers in our space. There's a few interesting sort of technical elements to the book that I think we might get into. And then, yeah, I've read some of your work, quite a bit of your work, and I'm a big fan of your work. And I can see certain maybe predilections in your work, certain stylistic interests that you have that I think are relevant to Harrison and relevant to this particular title. So, yeah, I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad the recommendation worked out.
Yeah, I appreciate all those kind words, and I really resonate with what you're saying about, you know, things that are your favorite, you don't have words for. You're almost kind of stumbling over yourself to find words for them, and sometimes silence is better. So maybe it's good that we didn't pick your favorite this time around. Harrison, we yeah, Harrison's a really interesting guy. I'd never heard of him, uh, and I only learned that he died in 2016, so not very long ago. He's Mountain Man Hemingway, I think is the best way to summarize him. Do you know a little bit about Harrison that you can kind of share with us?
Yeah, I can fill in some of the gaps. He's been a figure of some fascination of mine since I was, young, sort of naive, romantic, sensitive young man. Um, Harrison is from the Midwest originally. He's from Michigan, and he has a certain kind of Midwestern sensibility, and there's a certain pragmatism to his sort of way of approaching writing and approaching literary work. But he's also deeply romantic in the sort of capital R sense, and has a kind of lust for life, and approaches life as a feast to be devoured. And this is true of his writing, but it's also true of him as a person. um, Harrison was a poet originally, and I think he was primarily inspired by Rilke, and he's got some wonderful poems, and actually wrote a few really impressive prose poems. Uh, Letters to Yesenin is one. Yesenin was a Russian poet who died tragically. There's a sort of apocryphal story of Yesenin writing his final poem in the blood spilling from his wrist after he'd cut his wrists.
Oh wow.
And who knows if there's any truth to that. But Harrison, in a kind of depressive period in his own life, glommed onto Yesenin and wrote these incredible prose poems, sort of around some of the themes from Yesenin's work. He later started writing fiction, and actually Legends of the Fall, which is this novella that we'll talk about in a minute, I think was his first real commercial success. He'd written a few novels before that, and several since. Another one of my favorite novels is a novel he wrote called Dalva, which is interesting to me because it's from the point of view of a woman. And Harrison, I think, is the only writer I can think of who successfully pulls off writing from the point of view of someone of the opposite gender. And in Harrison's telling of this, his younger sister died when he was a child in some kind of tragic accident. I don't remember the exact details. And Harrison also, it should be mentioned, is kind of like rotund man, and he's blinded in one eye, and he sort of looks like a mythical figure if you look up pictures of him online. And he claims that in Dalva, it's like the spirit of his dead younger sister sort of speaking through him, and he's described previously writing this book in like a fugue state in which his sister is sort of like writing the novel through him. So anyway, he's sort of a fascinating figure. He was a hunter, and he was a great chef. He's got a great book on food, and some of his cooking exploits. So a guy who was sort of larger than life, and I happen to know some people who knew him in real life, and they confirm that sort of the stories and tales around this guy weren't just sort of mythology, weren't just sort of folklore, but in fact, he sort of lived many of these things. And I don't want to sort of spoil the guy's, memory, but some of these stories are pretty outrageous.
It's
So
it's
anyway,
always it's always gratifying when the man lives up to the legend.
yeah. Yeah, and in sort of every sense. I mean, he's obviously a very bright guy, and in many ways was a kind of like pointy-headed intellectual, but also had this very sort of vitalistic streak to him. I don't know what else to call it. It's this sort of vitalism, this lust for life, like I said, and a real sort of spirit of adventure, and this approach to life to experience the fullness of it, which I think is reflected in the main character of Legends of the Fall. And I think you can really feel Harrison writing through this character, Tristan, this young man, his own sort of sense of himself in the world. And yeah, he's a fascinating guy in every respect.
Most definitely. So on to Legends of the Fall, right? You recommended to me to read it in one sitting, and it's a short novella. It's maybe 120 pages, something like that. Not long at all. And I'm going to pass that recommendation out to the listeners. You need to read this in one sitting. It's like going 10 rounds with Mike Tyson in some ways, but it's so gratifying when you get to the end. Even if it's not, I'd say even if it's not um a happy ending in a conventional sense. It's an earned ending, which I think is more important
Mm,
than the happy ending that you get. But story starts out with the three Ludlow brothers. They are of English Cornish stock. Father, the elder Ludlow, he was a officer in the U.S. Army. Uh, he ends up leaving the army because he doesn't agree with the army's stance on what is dubbed the Indian question, which is really funny for a few different reasons. Um, so he moves out to Montana and he starts a ranch. World War I kicks off. America's not in the war yet, but these guys live so close to the Canadian border that they're able to travel to Calgary and enlist in the army. And you have the three sons: Alfred, the eldest, Tristan, the middle child, and also our main character, and then the youngest, Samuel, who is. It's funny. I talked to the Prudentialist about the brothers Karamazov on my first
mm,
two episodes, and Samuel reminds me very much of like an Alyosha. Just
interesting.
everyone loves this guy. He's everyone's favorite person to talk to. More intellectually uh, minded than an Alyosha, but definitely just brings that life into whatever room that he walks into. He's a student at Harvard, Samuel, and where he lives with his mother, who is a Boston socialite, but sometimes visits Montana. And she's got her own thing going on that we'll get to. But just right from the get go, we have a very interesting family dynamic for the Ludlow family.
Yeah, and I think one fascinating thing about this book, to me, is sort of reading it like you do have the characters, but it needs to be understood too that as Harrison, as the author, is like sort of fleshing them out, he has to do this in a very compressed way because of how long the book is and how much material, how much time needs to happen within the space of these 100 pages. And it's remarkable as a sort of technical matter how quickly and sort of seamlessly he draws out these sort of character archetypes of these three brothers. And I let me see if I can find the exact passage, but it's almost immediately when we first meet them. Um, in fact, when they're first introduced, you can almost tell from these two sentences almost everything you need to know about the three brothers. So, if it's all right, TR, I just want to read these two sentences when we first meet the brothers, and
Go
just to
ahead. Yeah.
demonstrate sort of this remarkable sort of technical writing moment where Harrison shows us who they are in these sort of minute details. So, these brothers, they're off on this quest to reach Calgary, from where they will depart and enlist in the war. And they're riding these horses, and we're in the autumn, and they're with the sort of ranch hand One Stab, who's this Indian who lives on the ranch and is, for all intents and purposes, like a member of the family. And so this is what we get from the description. Alfred, the oldest brother, said a prayer while Tristan, the middle brother, cursed and spurred his mount past Alfred and One Stab. Samuel, the youngest, dallied along with his eyes sharp on the flora and fauna, and that's it. And I mean, this may seem like a sort of trivial point, but that, as a reader, you almost slide right past that kind of description in those sentences. But in your mind, at least for me, I have this immediate sense of who these guys are, and I can almost predict just from those two sentences precisely what will happen with the rest of the novel.
And Harrison has, I mean, the term economy of words kind of gets overused, but he's definitely showing his mastery of language here, because you're right. I mean, these guys, I mean, they're archetypal characters, right? And in some sense, he's letting the reader fill in the gaps because he knows that they'll know who these guys are just from a couple quick sentences, right? You've got Samuel, who is the youngest and who's also just like the scientifically minded guy. He's really only in it for you know, he's a naturalist, but not in the same way that his brother Tristan is.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Tristan is sort of the wild one, the one who needs to be living off the land. Samuel is the one who's more comfortable in civilization, and then Alfred is almost like too civilized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, like the older brother or the younger brother Samuel, you know, literally stopping to smell the flowers in this particular point, and then we see the middle brother going out ahead of the pack, like sort of cursing and going out ahead. Um, and then the oldest brother stopping to say a prayer. And this is as they're departing their ranch, you know, this is as they're leaving. And I will say about the economy of words, there's something about Harrison being a poet, firstly, that I think has trained him on this economy of language. And I've noticed that some of my favorite writers are firstly poets who then become prose writers, become storytellers. And I think there's something about the practice of writing poetry that enforces this economy and enforces not just the compression of ideas, but how words, just like individual words, are operating in any given sentence. And there's just very little fluff. I mean, I don't want to go so far as to say that this novella is like word perfect, but you would be hard pressed to find language in here that is unnecessary, or that could just sort of be taken out without losing some vital sort of piece of meaning.
Definitely. No, and I think, you know, for all the writers out there that are listening to this podcast, even if you're not writing poetry, you need to be reading it and
Mm-hmm.
studying it just to understand, because it you're 100% right, Lomez, that that economy of language, that ability to not like the metaphors he uses are also just so good and so off the beaten path,
Mm-hmm.
and yet they work
Mm-hmm.
completely. And I think you're right that, I mean, this is already a short book, so I couldn't imagine an editor going in and, you know, cutting out this, that, or the other thing. But if they did, it would totally diminish the entire piece.
Mm-hmm.
Like that you can't. It is just there's no fat
Yeah.
in this at all. So the three brothers enlist, right, and then we're sort of we're introduced to more the ranch life, right? You get letters from, and this is one of the more interesting aspects of the book. The mother is sending the father letters from Boston to Montana where they live, and she's going into hysterics about, like, how could you let all of them go? You could have had Samuel's so young, you could have kept him home. Why are you doing this to me, sort of thing. Like it's obvious that Samuel's not only her favorite, but he's, you know, he's the baby of the family. He's also, you know, he's the sensitive young man, let's
Mm-hmm.
say, of the three. And it gets to a point where, you know, he just stops reading the letters.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is the ongoing dynamic with, so this is another sort of remarkable thing about the novel, is that it really is a kind of like ensemble novel that, despite it only being 100 pages, you see this really complex kind of interplay between probably a half dozen characters,
Mm,
where they're fully realized sort of people with their own motivations and backstories. They're not there just to like serve the main narrative thrust of what happens to Tristan. And I think a lesser writer um, would have maybe, you know, it would have been very easy to just like remove the mother entirely. I mean, she could just sort of be dead, or and there's like a lot of characters like this where you see the writer throwing all these balls up into the air in like the first 20 pages, which includes this strained, complex relationship with the older Ludlow. And a curious thing about this too is, like, we're told that she's like taking lovers. He doesn't really care. the marriage is kind of washed. And it's not even that it's like a marriage of convenience. It's just takes place in this very complex sort of, or I shouldn't say complex, but sort of singular context of this time and place.
It's
And
very old world.
it
You know,
is old world. It's very old world. Or as with everything in this novel, it's this point at which the old world is like coming into conflict with the new world and what's going to happen over the course of the remainder of the 20th century. And so there's this just weird tension there happening at all times. But you do see with Harrison here, which is so remarkable, like I said, him throwing all these balls up in the air. And each of these characters, he's going to have to somehow catch. He can't let these fall to the ground. And he's only got, again, 100 pages or so to do it. And the fact that he manages to, at various moments in the novel, like highlight each one of these balls in their own trajectory, their own path, and then somehow have the wherewithal by the end of it to catch all of these balls is just, it's remarkable. It's a remarkable technical feat from a writing standpoint.
One example early in the novella, there's the character Decker. He's the the ranch hand, right? He lives on the ranch with his wife Pet. She's an Indian too. And while the boys are away at war and Ludlow's kind of he's acting as like sort of a grandfather to Decker's daughter, right? And one day the police or the marshal comes by and he's like, hey, we heard that so and so has been here, and he shows him a wanted poster, and Ludlow goes, oh, I'd never seen him. I've heard of him. I think he escaped to San Francisco and then he went east to China, and the guy, it's Decker.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, and it looks just like Decker, and he makes sure one stab keeps Decker away, and you get Decker's entire life.
Yeah.
In those, like, in that brief, not even a paragraph, like maybe 3 sentences.
Yeah, it's so that's such a good example, because this backstory, which what is inferred through what you can infer through this is that he was this like petty thief or a bank robber maybe, who had escaped from Minneapolis and found his way to this obscure sort of like Montana town. And it's not just that these aren't just like throwaway backstory details. They actually come into play and explain who he is and choices that he makes, and this kind of personality that he has that, again, is distinct from these other characters. And this is another thing that Harrison is so remarkable, is that in this ensemble cast of these, half dozen more really characters, they're all distinct sketches. Like, they, in my mind, and there's a film about this, and there's a reason I've never watched the film, because I don't want it to disrupt the kind of image I have of these characters in my mind. But they're all different people. They're totally different people, and I can see them very clearly as being different from one another. So yeah, it really is just a really impressive piece of writing and piece of narrative storytelling.
Definitely. And so the boys are off at the front in World War I. They're in France, right? Alfred, he has, because he's got the air of aristocracy to him somewhat, and he's made an officer, right? Samuel, he's so well liked that he becomes I think he's aide de camp, or he's a runner.
Correct. Yeah.
For an officer, right? And then you've got Tristain, he's the kind of soldier that you want in a war, but he is hell in peacetime.
Right.
He's proficient at what he does. His years of knowing the land and hunting have just made him deadly, right? But if he gets a little drink in him, he's just raises hell, right?
You also see early on, and how he's described is that he kind of resents authority, or anyway, it is not other men who have authority over him. And he is, a very kind of Nietzschean man in this sense, which he is he is beholden to his own sort of code, and this gets him into quite a bit of trouble because though despite the fact that he is in many ways the perfect soldier, he also cannot be controlled, and he's not going to allow himself to be controlled, and he's not going to stand for some of the sort of petty requirements of obedience that other soldiers in his station would be beholden to. And so we see that this is not only going to get him in trouble, but actually is going to sort of deflect on all of the people and characters who come into contact with him.
Definitely. And you can even see early on that this is going to strain his and Alfred's relationship as they move forward in life. So in the war, you know, people die. Obviously, I mean that's like so banal to say, but it needs to be said. And Samuel ends up dying, and this breaks Tristan. Uh, we see Tristan. He holds Native American sort of burial rites for him. He cuts out Samuel's heart from his body, and then with another Canadian soldier who I think is he's like part Cree or something, they are able to encase it in wax so that it can be sent home, right? And buried on the land, like in a special spot that he knows that Tristan would or that Samuel would want to be buried. And then he goes out hunting. He he takes his carving knife, the knife that One Stab gave him, because One Stab, for all intents and purposes, One Stab is his father, right? And Ludlow, the elder, whose name I can't grab for whatever reason at the moment, he laments that, like, yeah, my son is more Indian than he is, a white man. And he laments that he doesn't have his son's affection the way that One Stab does. But there is one part, he's going through the boys' rooms and he sees he sees a raccoon skin over his son's pillow, over Tristan's pillow, and that was the skin of basically his pet, Tristan's pet raccoon, which I thought was really interesting because you don't typically think of raccoons as like that, like outside of like Pocahontas, you don't see raccoons as these domestic animals, but it would ride on horseback with Tristan, and it even attacked one of the mother's dogs and killed it, so it had to be put down. Which says a lot also later about Tristan's relationship with his mother. There's so much there that Harrison works with. It's like the more that I talk about it out loud, the more I'm like, oh wow, that connects to this and that. Like you'll see if my camera was on, you would see just the conspiracy board with all the yarn.
Right.
Just this is just how he connects these things together. But Ludlow the elder, he discovers a manuscript of a book that he published on Indians that Tristan annotated and read through probably a bunch of times, and it's even like scrawled in like little boy crayon, like this is my daddy wrote this, and it's got all of his thoughts on it, and you can see that like this is his father. This is something that he needed, like, oh, okay, my son does love me, sort of thing. Like I didn't completely alienate myself from him.
Yeah, there's so much here with Tristan and his father. Let me point something out. So my grandfather actually kept a pet raccoon, a couple of them, in fact.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and when I was a boy, I saw the last of these raccoons that ended up sleeping. It was a winter, and ended up sleeping in the truck in the engine and got killed when the engine got
geez.
started up. But this was not treated I mean, it was like, it's not sad. This is just like the kind of thing that happened. But the interesting thing about raccoons, like pet raccoons, is that they are attracted to very shiny objects. And they will like steal, like if you keep them in the house, they'll go and like steal and hoard, forks or other pieces of silver, or like any piece of glass or jewelry that they can get their hands on, or like shiny coins. So if you ever have a pet raccoon, that's something to be mindful of. Um,
Definitely lives up to their physiognomy.
yeah. Um, so the interesting thing about Tristan and his father is that the father, at some point, Ludlow, says about his son, his middle son, that he recognized in his son his own father, the grandfather, and
Mm.
that he makes a point about these sort of personalities sort of skipping a generation, and the grandfather is also this adventurer and sort of world traveler who's still lives in Cornwall, and travels the open seas. And there are stories of him going all over the world in the South Pacific, and taking Ludlow to see like whales somewhere. I can't remember all the details, but what we come to see is that Tristan, he doesn't belong to his father. He doesn't really belong to anyone. He's kind of he's this kind of unusual person, and he's even described in sort of supernatural terms at various points in the novel, that he kind of belongs to God, that he lives outside of time, and outside of these more sort of terrestrial relationships amongst brothers. And I don't want to, it's like, I guess we're just giving away stuff here, but he's not buried alongside his family. He's always apart from and outside of these kind of terrestrial concerns, and living in a world and according to a set of circumstances that are divine, that are determined by a fate, that are beyond sort of comprehension.
He's
And
he's always looking out across the sea of fog.
yes, and even described explicitly in some cases of like stepping beyond and into the gates of hell, in it, beyond the veil, and seeing the world of things beyond things. And he's described at one point as he's compared to Cain. And there's this idea that after his brother dies, that's somehow his fault, that he's somehow responsible for the death of Samuel. And this curse is placed over him that follows him around for the rest of his life. Um, I don't read it in quite that way. I don't think Harrison's the kind of writer where statements like that and references like that are meant to be taken literally. But there is a sense that his fate is like sort of predetermined, and it's a tragic kind of fate, but it's also provides him with the fullness of life and these limit experiences that are unavailable to other sort of mortal people. And it's one stab, I think, who can kind of see this and understand this, and so has a perspective to offer Tristan that he can't get elsewhere. He can't get from his father. He can't get this from his brothers, who he feels a distance from. He can't get this from the women in his life, who he's sort of distanced from in various ways.
Well, he gets it from one. He does get it from his wife Isabel.
Yeah, yeah.
And we'll get to that a little later in the novella, because he's not betrothed to Isabel right away. He has a wife, or a fiance, who he later marries, named Susanna.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so Tristan, he uh, he goes off hunting. He scalps a bunch of German soldiers and brings the scalps back. Right. This is automatically seen as like he's gone insane,
Mm-hmm.
and he's sent to the hospital. And it's weird that the psychologist it's weird that Harrison notes that the psychiatrist that he sees is a Jungian
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to, like, I guess, a Freudian at the
I
time.
guess, yeah.
But it's, and I mean, this is a book dealing with archetypes, so I guess it, maybe this is Harrison kind of nodding to Jungian archetypes and depth psychology a little bit here. I thought that was a neat little um, reference that he makes, that he definitely didn't have to, but I think it does add, even the psychologist has some depth to him because of that.
Yeah,
But
I also want to point out here too. Sorry for interrupting, but this episode where Tristan and his sort of comrade Noel cut the heart of his brother out of his rib cage. Like in the pouring rain, they go into this field of dead soldiers and come across his brother's body, which has been cut to ribbons by machine gun fire, and his face is like in these contortions from the pain of sort of suffering through this mustard gas attack, and the lurid detail with which they Harrison describes him carving out his brother's heart is like it's just so incredible. It's so vivid. There's only, I mean, the only other writer I can think of who comes close to this kind of evocative detail that nonetheless passes the test of verisimilitude. So you don't get the sense that he's just trying to shock you with these like crazy details, like what if this happened, but it like feels absolutely real. And maybe like Cormac McCarthy can do this and does at times, but it's again this sort of remarkable storytelling, this remarkable writing, to be able to pull something like that off, to have in your mind, okay, I'm going to have this character go cut the heart out of his brother and melt down this wax and preserve the heart in wax and then put it in a box and then send it back to Montana. I mean, it's like crazy, but he pulls it off and it doesn't feel like sort of cringe or inauthentic. It feels totally real.
definitely, yeah. And I think McCarthy is a good pull there. I was thinking Homeric, but I
Yeah.
think McCarthy, it's, especially you read something like Blood Meridian,
Mm-hmm.
And actually dealing with very similar themes, which
Yeah.
is, if you're gonna write the American novel, or something American, you have to include Indians.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I did the Last Things Film Festival.
Oh yeah.
So our buddy Last Things, he talked to however many frogs about their favorite films. I picked The Searchers,
Oh nice.
right?
Yep.
And Tristan like just that archetypal, um, too civilized for savagery, but too savage for the civilized world. Like he just lives on that edge, and I think that is the American character.
Yeah, this is a huge theme in all of Harrison's work. And I mentioned previously his novel Dalva, and the sequel to that, which is also just a remarkable novel called The Road Home. Um, these themes around Indians and these characters occupy a huge place in his writing, and he's very sympathetic, to the Indians and their what he would probably characterize as mistreatment, but really just sort of the historical sort of tragedy of their fate, and
Hmm.
what it means to be an Indian in the West, to be like a Sioux who's fighting against Custer, and Custer I think is actually even mentioned in the
He
novella at
is,
one
yeah,
point.
yeah. And Ludlow hates Custer, and
Yeah,
I think he like served under Custer and left the army before Little Bighorn, and Ludlow even talks about how he gets a little perverse Schadenfreude there,
yeah, that's right.
which is a really, which is pretty ballsy from Harrison,
Yes.
honestly, too, because he wrote this in what, the 70s. So
Yeah, this was late 70s. Yeah.
it's not like today where like you have like H1B's Sherman posting.
Yeah, yeah.
this is I'll give Harrison his props there, even though I don't necessarily agree. He's it takes balls to do that.
Yeah, it does. And I don't know. You could probably make some assumptions about Harrison's politics or whatever, but I think it's mostly irrelevant. What he's saying feels honest, and he doesn't then though try to disguise the Indian character and how that's distinct from Ludlow and even Tristan in this case. Anyway, I feel like this novel just and Harrison's work generally definitely incorporates the mythos of the Indians and the conflict that arises out of the modern world and the white world coming into contact with the Indian world, and what that means for these Indians, without sugarcoating it, without pretending as if these are just like peaceful, like they were living in this sort of peaceful Eden that was without its own sort of horrific carnage and violence. I mean, in the case of One Stab, for example, we learn that he won't let anybody into his little like sort of hut that he has on the property, because in the hut he has this bag of scalps that he's collected over the years.
A bunch of them are whites too.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
So it's not like we're pretending. It's not like Harrison's pretending as if these are just like these peaceful, innocent, sort of Edenic peoples, who have kind of been cursed by sort of white incursion into their utopia. So anyway,
yeah, he's not. What's the Lone Ranger's buddy's name?
Tonto? No, wait.
Tonto. Yeah,
Yeah.
Tonto. He's not Tonto.
Right.
He's not. He's not what modernity has turned Indians into, where they're just this perpetual victim,
Right,
of stolen land and smallpox blankets and just this, intentional, horrible genocide.
right.
Like one stab definitely got his licks into, and I, shout out to Last Things for letting me kind of go off on that point in our talk. You should definitely go watch The Searchers if you haven't.
Yeah.
But so after Samuel is, after his heart is encased, you see Alfred, who's the worst thing about Alfred is that he's so real. Like he's such a bastard,
Mm-hmm.
but he means he's not mustache twirling villain. He's just like out for himself. He's a striver, and that's what's infuriating about
Yes,
him.
and also a bit sort of naive. He doesn't have a proper amount of sort of cynicism towards the world. And I think of Alfred as like kind of, this sort of bow tie wearing boomer con older brother.
Yep.
Who, like you said, like his heart is in the right place for the most part, but is seeing the world only through this narrow lens of personal advancement, and through the kind of banal daily politics that he's sort of surrounded himself by.
You can't
He's a
even call him.
bureaucrat,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Bureaucrat is the perfect word, because I was thinking of like, he's not really a hicklib, but he would definitely take that position if
Uh-huh.
it was advantageous for him.
Right.
But yeah, no, he's a bureaucrat. He's kind of a yes man. Um, and he visits Tristan while they're on the front, and Tristan just like Tristan almost can't look at him.
Right.
Like he almost, where you have this sort of mourning, like this sort of, and I'm gonna say Homeric again, because
Yeah.
you've got Tristan who's mourning over his brother, and Alfred, he's sad, but he's not set against himself. He's just kind of trying to do the stiff upper lip thing. It's very, he was born to be an officer,
Yes.
kind of thing, and he was born to be set apart from the rest of the family.
When we see he eventually becomes a senator, you know, and that was like always the direction he was headed. And again, there's this great detail where you kind of learn everything you need to know about him when the father, Ludlow, learns that his youngest son has died, and that Tristan, the kind of wild, chaotic, but interesting and sort of more compelling son, is off on some other adventure, and that it's his oldest son, Alfred, who's coming home. And he regrets the fact that his oldest son is coming home. Like
And
he has this,
he dare not say it out loud, but he has this twinge of,
yes,
oh, it had to be Alfred. You
yes.
know?
And it's this great moment. And it's, it cuts so hard because, you know, I'm a father, you know, and I have several kids, and you never can do this. You can never tell yourself, oh, I would prefer this kid to this kid or something. But maybe somewhere inside you, especially in this moment of like extremis where you're mourning after your son, and maybe there is this one kid you actually don't want to see. And it's almost funny, this moment, but it's so real, you know. It's just, it
Yeah,
feels so true.
you know, and Ludlow, he just dashes it away right away, but
Uh-huh.
he knows that he's had the thought,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
he punishes himself for having it.
Right.
But like, but at the same time, he like acknowledges that, yes, this is how I feel. It's so well done.
Yeah.
And
But
you
again,
know,
in like 2 sentences, this thing
yep.
happens.
Oh,
It's
totally.
incredible.
It's
Yeah.
all, if you were skimming,
Uh-huh.
you'd miss so much.
Yeah.
You know, you'd miss the entire book almost
Yeah.
if you were just trying to skim it to get through it, which, you know, for whatever reason people do that.
I also want
Uh
to say, sorry, just while we're on this point in the novel, when again, it's this remarkable thing where the novel's building up an incredible amount of pathos around the death of Samuel, and the various characters learning about this in these different moments. And so like the wife learns about it, and then, you know, Tristan learns, or not the wife, but the mother learns about it, Tristan learns about it, okay, the brothers, etc. And they all go through this tremendous amount of grief, and you're waiting around as a reader for the moment at which Ludlow himself learns about his son's death. And you see what happens is the letter is in one of the characters' hands. I can't remember who's holding it,
I
but
think it's Pet.
yeah, so Pet, who's kind of a side character, but nonetheless significant, she's bringing the letter to Ludlow, and there's a paragraph break. And I'm paraphrasing here, but the next paragraph is something like, you know, Ludlow aged or became like an old man over the course of the next like 10 years. And you don't actually ever see his reaction, but we like skip through this incredible amount of time. And it's like, I don't even know how to describe this moment. It's such an insane kind of narrative move there to sort of pull the rug out from under your reader like that. They never get to experience that moment of direct mourning. And what it almost, the experience of it almost matches what like Ludlow's experience of it is. It pulls him out of time. Like he goes into this sort of like fugue state, and then only awakes some time later, and is never
I think he
actually.
even has a stroke.
Yeah, he does have a stroke, and we don't. But it's not like it's directly like where he receives the letter and then
Right.
sort of collapses into it.
It's not that melodramatic, but
So here's, I found it. Let me just read the sentence because it's just kind of remarkable. Uh, Pet came in the door, stomping the snow from her boots. She handed Ludlow the letter from Tristan and looked away. So did Decker. Only one Stab watched Ludlow open the letter, not fearing the worst possible or probable, because he owned the Cheyenne sense of fatality that what had already happened. You couldn't change it, and trying to was like throwing stones at the moon. Then paragraph break. Still very much in his late prime, Ludlow grew old overnight. And then we never see any actual reaction to the letter,
what
which
I
is,
love about that
yeah,
is he's built this up so much that Harrison almost knows that he can't like anything that he writes about it is just going to come off as like kind of fake and
Yep.
melodramatic and kind of gay. So he just skips all that and he
Yep.
lets the reader the thing that he does in this that a lot of people don't is he trusts the reader.
Yes.
And he trusts them to not only understand what he's putting across, but also to fill in the gaps that he leaves for them to have their own experience with the novel. You know,
Yeah. And you know what this demonstrates is, if you trust yourself as a writer, and then, you know, in turn trust the reader, there is a certain, you know, it's cliche, but very oftentimes less is more. And that the emotional power of not saying the thing directly is often much greater than anything you could accomplish as a writer by trying to describe what is ultimately kind of ineffable. You know, this feeling of overwhelming, immense, sort of infinite grief. Like, you're never going to be able to achieve that through mere description. And you bring the reader up to that moment, and then just let the reader kind of stare out over the abyss and make of it what they will. And there's so much power in that.
it's kind of like when Lovecraft would write about indescribable horror,
Mm-hmm.
and he would just let the reader sort of fill that in them. So like everyone has a different indescribable horror for themselves, and you're not going to come up with something better than somebody in their own mind will, and they'll
Yeah.
build it up in their mind, and it'll kind of fester away and eat at them. And if you just kind of come out and say it, it's then suddenly the mystery is gone, and it's not as bad as you thought it was going to be. So here you have Harrison describing, or at least insert indescribable grief here.
Right. Yeah. Right.
It's masterful. It really, and like again, yeah, it's a shame that I did not hear of this guy until he's well since dead. This is yeah, this is it's a clinic on how to write well.
Yeah, it really is. And you know, you can't do this though without um preceding that moment with sufficient care for the unique motivations and interests and psychologies of these characters. And again, like, it's not like you're just passing off the work of this emotional catharsis for the reader to sort of do completely on their own. It's just that you're front loading all of that work before you get to the moment. And just how much you have to do before you get to the moment. And that's really actually what matters narratively, is all the work you do before you get to the moment, where, you know, you almost want your reader to be able to predict what's going to happen on their own.
Yeah, the ever since that Star Wars movie came out, subverting expectations has been, I mean, it's been played to death, but I think it was
Yep.
already kind of dead when that came out. There, if you can create a relationship with your reader so much so that they understand where you're going with this,
Mm-hmm.
and they have the trust in you to follow you on that path, you can that's even better than like the twist ending or the shocker or something like that you can hold their hand towards something and show them this beautiful thing, whether it's beautiful in a tragic sense or beautiful like love or something like that. That's that's something that's going to stick with somebody than some cheap plot device that
Yeah.
has been overused 1,000 times, you know.
Yeah. And I will say, just from my point of view as a reader, the emotional impact of, you know, the shock or twist ending, while on some maybe sort of intellectual level can be satisfying, it has nothing on the impact of seeing this kind of fated circumstance play out exactly as I expect, but you know, rendered in this sort of honest and tragic way. It's just way more powerful when that's done right. I mean, it's very hard to do, and so I understand
Definitely.
why the trick ending is often more appealing. You know, you can be clever, but if you can write a story where its outcome is predictable, that's way more satisfying, or very often is way more satisfying.
Especially if you can, because almost you don't have to worry about a certain aspect that you can, okay, let's say you're writing a very basic plot that everybody knows, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good. You don't have to think about that. You can think about the characters.
Right.
You can put a lot more energy into not only their emotional state and their well-being, but also the well-being of secondary characters, tertiary characters. What does this mean for Joe Schmo down the street? Like you can focus in on things that are more important than plot.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've read All Quiet on the Western Front several times,
Yes.
and right before the ending, I almost always want to close the book and like because I know I know that Paul is going to die,
Uh-huh.
but I don't want him to.
Yes.
But then I'm compelled to finish it because it's just such a good ending. Like
Yes.
so. Another note for writers out there: it's okay if people know the ending.
Yes.
Just make it worth it.
Yes. Absolutely.
So, we have Tristan. He's locked up for scalping, for killing and scalping the Germans, which I thought was really funny because again, America isn't in the war yet,
Right.
right? I actually the previous episode to this I did was released today actually with John Slaughter. We were talking Company K
Mm.
by William March, and it's about the Americans in the war, and they're kind of some of the stories. It's a collection of vignettes. I highly recommend it. And some of the stories you have these guys and they're literal cowboys. These guys are descended from Civil War veterans, from Indian War veterans,
Yep.
and they're coming to Europe that still has this sort of antiquated view of warfare. They still, even it's more gentlemanly, it's more proper to gas and machine gun men to death than it is to kill them up close and scalp them.
Right.
And I found it's I have a kind of gallows humor, so I was laughing at that part that this guy who's super effective, Tristan, he's a super effective soldier. If they had like 100 Tristans, they could win the war.
Right.
But instead, they declare him insane.
Right.
Like just really really interesting commentary there by Harrison.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
I think he points this out, right? This exact absurdity. When Tristan then he's sent to, maybe he's in Paris or some other city, to go see, to go to the psych ward, and we hear from this doctor who's seen all these soldiers come in who are just scared and like sort of pissing themselves, and they've been truly traumatized by war and are suffering from what we call PTSD or whatever. um Tristan, who's been sent there because he's scalping these Germans, and he has gone into a state of kind of manic vengeance for his brother, but the doctor immediately recognizes that actually this is totally normal, and that he's not actually crazy at all, that this is the one case where, despite the fact that people are telling him this guy is truly insane, the doctor recognized that no, him scalping these guys and wanting to scalp these guys is not insane. That's actually, even in some sense, like a healthy response. And the absurdity of thinking, like you said, that mustard gas and machine gunning is somehow more civilized, is not lost on the doctor. And so the doctor, very quickly, I don't know that he releases him, or basically provides cover so that Tristan can escape. from this
They
sideboard.
give him, yeah, they give him kind of a get out of jail free card
Yeah,
where he's allowed to escape the hospital, but if anybody were to stop him, they'd be like, "Oh, this guy's crazy," and we're kind of sending him home anyway.
right.
So Tristan goes to Cornwall, and he spends some time with his grandfather, right? So Ludlow the Elder's father, right? And they are just cut from the same cloth.
Yes.
I think even the grandfather, I think he still has a sailboat.
Yes.
So
Correct.
he's just so old world. You know, he's he's a merchant. He delivers this, that, and the other to around the world. Uh and he lets Tristan sort of come along with him until they can drop him off in Boston. And you see this adventurism in Tristan, like he's almost alive again, where
Yes.
he's sort of he died with his brother.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So he sort of comes to his grandfather's house, and we learn earlier that, in the words of Ludlow, the father, that these two are alike, and that Ludlow's concern was that there had been this sort of genetic lapse, and all of his fathers, the grandfathers, sort of lust for life, this adventurous spirit, this kind of uh, unshakable restlessness had passed him and gone into his son. And then so he meets the grandfather. And again, what's so incredible about this is this happens in like a paragraph, maybe
Mm-hmm.
2 paragraphs. He has this instant recognition of his grandson, though they have not.
He's like,
I don't know.
I'm your grandson, so
Yeah,
you are.
so you are, yeah. Well, and then he takes him to the boat, and he immediately starts teaching him how to sail. And of course, this mountain cowboy from Montana has no idea what he's doing, but picks it up very quickly, takes after his grandfather very quickly. And like you said, there's this kind of rebirth, because what Tristan has discovered here is what he was meant to do, that he's been kind of trapped in Montana his whole life in this sort of provincial ranch. And of course, like from our point of view, urban bugmen, this seems like this remarkable sort of romantic thing, up in northern Montana on this massive ranch, cutting horses and etc. But to Tristan, this is very provincial. It's very small. It's not adventurous. There's nothing really romantic about it. So here he is for the first time exposed to the kind of life that he was always meant to live. Fate has kind of taken him out of his father's grasp, and put him in proximity to his real sort of his place, his real father, his grandfather in this sense. And it's at this point that the novella really starts to remind me of like Conrad.
Mm.
And it's not lost on me that the form that this novel follows, this sort of novella, very much is like a kind of Conrad pulp in a way, these sort of seafaring adventure tales. And I don't know, I mean, I'm sure Harrison has read a lot of Conrad and maybe drawing from Conrad directly in this novel, but you do get that sense that it's very Conradian
Right.
from this point on.
And it's interesting because Tristan has been built up as this sort of, he's the wild horse. He cannot be tamed. He cannot be broken.
Yes.
But as soon as he gets on ship, he falls right in the line. Right. In his grandfather, he has found a man worthy of
Yes.
leading him. And it goes to show that leadership and followership is just so ingrained in us, but it needs to be earned.
Yep.
It's this book really, it speaks to the experience of men, even if your life is just kind of working in that office job all day. It's not even pornographic. It's affirming.
Yeah. Yeah, the grandfather's a great character, and there are a lot of parallels to the grandfather throughout the novel, starting actually the very beginning. Tristan even, I think, assumes at one point that he's going to live, a long life, sort of despite himself,
Mm.
just as his grandfather has, and in fact ends up sort of, living a very similar kind of life,
Yeah, no, he
and that
fulfills
ends
that
in a
destiny.
similar kind of way. Yeah, he fulfills that destiny, and all of the things that we learn about the grandfather and his interest to Ludlow and the grandkids and the sort of mythology built up around him becomes true of Tristan too. They all want him to sort of tell him stories, and he brings these gifts from faraway places, but he's almost sort of reluctant to do that. He almost can't understand their fascination with this
Yeah,
stuff.
this is life, like
Yeah, it's just me living life. It's me sort of relieving the boredom of life. I mean, he's not there's this strange irony too, where we're told he's actually has this incredible gift for making money. And he just finds himself like collecting piles of money here and there, but he has no use for it. It's this sort of pedestrian terrestrial concern. And he has some scorn even for like his father and his mother, and then his sort of quasi lover, because of their devotion to these pedestrian concerns. But what he sees in his grandfather, and one stab for that matter, are these other personalities whose interests sort of transcend all of that, are outside of the realm of day-to-day sort of mundane concern, and again exist sort of on the other side of the line, like on the other side of the veil, in the world of things beyond things.
Should we talk about Susanna now?
Sure. Talk about the women in the novel.
Yeah, so Susanna is a cousin of the Ludlow family. She is Tristan's betrothed. Uh, she is described as kind of a sickly girl, very proper, very respectful, at least initially. Her father is a kind of a big deal in Boston, and she is infatuated with Tristan. She sees him as the kind of the savage man. She cannot get enough of this guy, right? And when Tristan comes home and they're able to give Samuel a proper burial right away, Tristan uh, marries Susanna and just gets right to work trying to, and he even says this, trying to replace Samuel.
Yeah.
And he feels terrible for this because he's literally just using her as sort of a like a broodmare.
Totally.
You know,
It's like explicit, that connection. Yeah.
yeah, like, and this actually, this probably more than anything else splits Alfred and Tristan up, more than anything else in the novel, because he is in love with Susanna, right? He just, he can't stand to hear their lovemaking in the train car. I and it doesn't get to the level of smut. Harrison is very artful with his choice of words, but you can tell what's going on, and it's kind of funny, and it's also very sad at the same time, because everyone knows exactly what's going on, but they're still letting it go on.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of love triangle between Alfred, Tristan, and Susanna is like the perfect um like parable for like any PUA guy. Like I could imagine Rivellino, like reading this novel and like drawing the green lines on, Tristan
So why
versus
why is
Alfred.
Alfred covering his
Yeah,
manhood?
Alfred's got, cock shame, and he's leaning into Susanna, and there's Tristan, just like he doesn't have a care in the world, or anyway, his concerns are just so sort of primitive and carnal and like detached from any kind of you know, marriage or like long-term interest in Susanna. Like you said, she's just a broodmare for him. And
And she's
it's
happy to be that.
yeah, she is. She's in fact, she can't help herself. And she knows it too. She, there's this interesting dynamic too, where her father, the Eastern financier, sort of who we're told is, in the same circles as JP Morgan, etc., wants her to marry Alfred, the up and coming, political man, this probable senator from Montana, who is in his own right, obviously going to be very wealthy. He's a pragmatist. He would, for all intents and purposes, be a wonderful husband and raise a family and be able to care for her in sort of all the ways that on paper seem perfect. But none of that matters in the face of this just force of nature that the middle brother represents, who is almost beyond these sort of terrestrial concerns, whose interests are adventure and the ocean and trouble and risk and danger, and doesn't care about any of this stuff, including her, and how this only heightens and amplifies her passion for him. It's like the perfect PUA sort of parable.
Yeah, so the whole family travels back to Montana, right? And all the while he's just going to town on her, right? And in the back of his mind, he knows I've got 6 weeks to impregnate her because I'm gonna go meet Grandpa in Cuba.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna go do more adventure stuff, and she's just gonna have to deal with it. But he never tells her this. I think he tells her like the night before he leaves.
The night before he leaves, yeah.
He's like, "Oh, I'm gonna be gone for a few weeks." Ends up leaving for like 5 years.
Yeah.
Like, and he doesn't. You know, it's weird because he acknowledges that he's kind of a dick for doing this, but he also just knows that he just has to do it.
Well, he only regrets it insofar as it hurts his brother. And he doesn't want to shame or embarrass or betray his brother. And it's not that he has total lack of concern for Susanna. He's not like
He's not
entirely
a monster.
crass. He isn't. But his primary concern is for his brother, but also, by this point in the novel, Tristan's taken on this sort of almost resignation to fate, that the world, that God, that these larger forces are buffeting him around, and he's just there to sort of experience it. Or I don't mean to say that he's like submissive or passive character. He's not at all. But he's operating in this dimension beyond what the other characters are.
He's walking in faith.
Yes.
He's like, I've when I've started this podcast, I didn't expect to explore Christianity so much, but it's just everywhere in anything worth reading.
Yeah.
And Tristan he understands that whatever he's doing is not really his own, but it is up to him to succeed or fail.
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting messaging from Harrison.
Actually, this is an interesting question. Do you see Christianity in this book in a sort of meaningful way? I mean, it's there obviously, and there's sort of biblical language to this book, and there is certainly a way to kind of read. I mean, because again, it's just these true archetypes. So like the Christianity is almost there by default. It has to be.
Right.
But
right.
do you see anything more explicit than that?
I don't. And I thought about it, and I thought if I twist the work around a bit and I kind of squint and put it far away from my face and take it up real close, I can kind of see it.
Mm.
But at the same time, it's, if you tell a true story, it's just these things are just going to come out. But I don't see Harrison as having it be an explicit. Maybe it's like a prodigal son tale, but also, but kind of not really. Like
Yeah.
there's so much here, and there you could definitely see Christianity in it, but not not so overt. It's not like, I'm at this point I'm beating a dead horse whenever I mention like God's not dead.
Yeah.
Where it's just like this cringe fest of like, look at this world that could be if only the good Christians were in charge, sort of thing.
Right.
But when something is true and when it's beautiful, it's naturally pointed to God, and that's
Yes.
that's where I kind of see, because this is more a book about naturalism
Yes,
than
totally.
than any sort of religion. You know,
Yes.
this book is spiritual, not religious.
Yeah, I think that's actually fair. I mean, it's cringe when you like couch it like that because, just like the sort of connotations with those sorts of woo, new agey,
Right, I'm threading
um,
a needle here.
soft. Well, because it makes it seem sort of like unseriously spiritual,
Hmm.
but it's very seriously spiritual. And I mean, there are like a lot of sort of direct, certainly Old Testament references in here. And there's something just inherent again to the kind of really like sort of wasp personality types that we're seeing in this book, and that again are just by default have this kind of Christian spirituality to it. And I don't know, I don't think Harrison is like trying to sort of hide anything, or there's no like grand sort of hidden metaphor here that he's expecting us to see, but it's just there. It's just sort of part of the fabric of the world that they're in and the kind of decisions they're making and what they're doing. So anyway, yeah.
And I mean, he's also writing about a time when, still 90% of people went to church, and,
Sure. Yep.
people owned a Bible,
Yep.
and not in this sort of, not in a way that, today people like want to be trad
Yeah.
and they wear it like an identity and they wear it like a fashion statement. Like, this was just part of people's lives.
Yeah. It is interesting though, like when various characters die, the kind of elegies they receive are one stabs, sort of like Native American songs. Like I don't recall them like reading the Bible at any point
No,
or finding solace in their religion.
I think
So
even in
yeah.
Boston, they just kind of gloss over,
Yeah.
the meeting with his friends from Harvard.
Right. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, it's and I'm gonna keep mentioning different writers, but reminds me of Melville.
Yeah. Who's mentioned
And
here? Who's another
yep,
reference book? By the way, have you the Melville book they mentioned? Have you read that?
Billy Budd. I have
N-
not,
No, it's
or not. Pierre, right?
yeah, Pierre.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I have it. I just haven't read it.
yeah. Likewise, I had underlined it because I thought, oh, maybe I should go read this. Maybe there's
Yeah,
something in there.
yeah, and also, Melville, famous for his, obviously Moby Dick, but he was a sailor. Most
Sure.
of his stories were sea stories, and
Yep.
so there's something about like that late 19th century, like the old world coming into clash with the new world. That
Yeah, and he also mentions these great John Henry Patterson books about I think that's the author. I'm pretty sure that's the author about these African voyages. He goes to these British colonies. I mean, these are true stories. One is the Man-Eaters of Savo, which became a novel, or excuse me, a film. I can't remember the name of the film, about these lions who are like eating
right,
people.
right, right, right. With Val Kilmer, I
Val
think,
Kilmer, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
I forget what it's called, but yeah, no, that was that. I remember that one. I'll end up linking it later when I Google it. But yeah, that's
And
a great
yeah,
film.
just to get back to the novella too, one another thing that I love about this and about Harrison's writing is the details that he provides about the world that they're in are so true to the historical context in which it's written that it's like a lesser writer would trip up on some of these small details. Like, this is a guy who knows what he's talking about. He knows the language. He understands, like, there's all of these details about the sailing. There's all of these details about these guys running alcohol from Canada back to the States, and the details about the war, and the details about the ranch, and like being on a ranch in the early 20th century in Montana, and the day-to-day work entailed by that. And to get all those details right is not a trivial thing. It's really hard. And you feel when you're reading this novel that you have total trust in the author to get this stuff right. And to get these small details right is really everything in order to sort of create this tapestry that you can sort of walk into as a reader and forget that you're in the world, like a fictional world created by a writer. The writer has to get those little details right, because the instant you see something that's off, you immediately leave that world. Suspension of disbelief is gone, and you're back just sort of like, okay, I wonder what's going on Twitter, and you go back to your phone. So I just want to say, as another matter, getting these period details right is hugely important. It's not just like autistic or pedantic to care about this stuff. Like, you
Totally.
have to get this stuff right as a writer.
So my second book, which you actually blurbed kindly, was a period piece.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I tried to work in as much as possible and try and make these guys feel like they're living in the time that they're living in.
Mm-hmm.
And it is hard,
Yeah.
especially the further away that you get from something, right? So obviously it's going to be easier for Harrison to write about living in a ranch in Montana regardless of the year,
Mm-hmm.
right? But for him to be able to write about sailing, like literally, he's the grandfather is like the last sailboat sailor in
Yeah.
some, at least in a commercial sense, right? The guy is, a few hundred miles away from like the Battle of Jutland,
Yeah, right.
where you've got the dreadnoughts going at each other from like miles away from each other, and he's in a sailboat, kind of like the last of a dying art.
Yeah. And by
And
the way, yeah, I'll just say, like, the way that you achieve this effect is not by reading, 100 Wikipedia articles. It's by reading, like, literature of the time.
mhm,
And this is the thing about, being a writer. You have to be a voracious reader. And it's not just about getting the, like, cadence of storytelling, but also just there's no way to otherwise duplicate the immersive experience of being in another place and time. Um,
are you familiar with Victor Davis
I
Hansen?
am, yeah, yeah.
He's a classics professor, kind of like a cringe boomercon at this point.
He's pretty based, I have to say. I've seen him speak in person, and more based than you might imagine.
I mean, I'll have to. I stopped kind of consuming his podcast after a while, but
Yeah,
like he's very much like, we got to stop like immigration.
yeah.
They're ruining California, and but he wrote, when he was doing his classics work, he wrote, I think it's A War Like No Other. It was about the Peloponnesian War,
Mm.
and for in order to understand how difficult it was for the Spartans to destroy the Athenians' crops, he got himself into like the bronze armor of the time, right? And just started hacking away at an olive orchard with a couple of his grad students.
Amazing.
So like, if experience is
Yes.
better than reading,
Yes.
obviously.
Even better. Yes.
So if you can if you want to write a book about a sailboat, get on a friggin' sailboat.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
no, it's Harrison. It's clear just by what he writes about that Harrison lived a life, and like you think about like the pulp fiction writers of the early 20th century, especially most famously probably L. Ron Hubbard, right, where he would just write like these, basically just fantasy tales. What's that term? Not male power fantasy, but something like that, where he's just a self. Every character is just a self insert for
Uh-huh.
his
Uh-huh.
desires, but he's not really. He has no idea what he's talking about. You know, Harrison's like the exact opposite here.
Yeah, Harrison definitely, like I said, going back to one of the earliest things we were talking about on this call, like he lived the life that he sort of pursued through his writing and through his poetry. And there are like a number of incredible stories you can find about him. And he shows up like in some strange places. There's a Anthony Bourdain, has, what's that show? His like cooking show.
No
No
reservations.
Reservations. I believe there's a whole episode devoted to Jim Harrison where Bourdain comes out to Montana and Harrison makes him this like massive feast from, this elk hunt or something that he's just come back from. And there's this great documentary that you can find, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's Jim Harrison and Thomas McGuane, and I believe Richard Brodigan, and one other writer from this sort of particular milieu in the early 70s who go tarpon fishing down in the Florida Keys. And it's just these guys like boozing out of control and like fishing. And there's this great line actually in the novella that I think is attributed to Teddy Roosevelt that says something like, I drink the wine of life with a splash of brandy in it, or
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like, or with a
yeah.
glass of brandy in it or something. And that you get that sense like when you read about Harrison, and it certainly applies to, Tristan in this novel as well.
So you did a stream with Last Things and Dan Baltic
Yeah.
about the dying or the last rock star novelist. So that's Updike, that's Mailer, and I think it was Roth,
Yeah.
right? And like you can tell that those guys, I mean, their whole life is just getting drunk and chasing skirt,
Yeah.
and that became the model for what young men should aspire to be. Meanwhile, you've got guys like Jim Harrison who, when they're not writing about their exploits, they're having real adventures. They're living the kind of life that men ought to be living.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's kind of a crime that, and not. I love Updike. I love Mailer. I haven't read much Roth, but he's very talented. But it sucks that these are the guys that have the spotlight, um, and the infamy, and somewhat. And guys like Jim Harrison are kind of they're. I only just heard of him, and I think I'm a pretty well read guy.
Yeah, it's funny. I kind of wonder why Harrison's stature is not more pronounced than it is. I mean, because during sort of the heyday of his writing career, among other sort of literary people, he's very well regarded. He's kind of like, I don't know if I want to use this term, but he's like a writer's writer.
Mm,
And, I know people I've talked to who have tremendous, other writers I know have tremendous respect for Harrison. He's kind of well known in certain circles, and certainly a lot of books that he's written have had commercial success. I mean, Legends of the Fall was a massive movie with Brad Pitt and
oh,
Anthony
what's his name? Yeah, yeah,
Hopkins.
yeah.
So it's like there's huge sort of public facing. And he wrote another book called The Wolf, or Wolf, it might be just be called, which was made into a Jack Nicholson and I think Nicole Kidman film about a werewolf.
Mm.
It's like this very pulpy, almost
I
sort of
think that was
stupid.
actually his first novel too, if I'm
I think you're right. That was his first novel. His second, and but he's got so many great pieces where he has this other great novel that, again, it's like sort of politically ambiguous, but I could imagine like Pine Tree Twitter like loving this novel. It's about these guys who are getting increasingly incensed by like sort of the degradation of the environment, and they go to blow up this dam, and the title is A Good Day to Die.
Mm.
And it's, Harrison for sure has some sort of lefty sympathies, so there is this like this thing that you can read into his work, but whatever, I choose to ignore it because frankly I don't think it's actually that relevant.
I wonder if if he ever ran into Ted Kaczynski.
Oh, I bet I
Like
well,
they met at the supermarket one day
yeah,
or
I mean,
something, you know, like
so Harrison was out in eastern Montana, east of Bozeman. Kaczynski was up in Lincoln, which is, where Lincoln is actually is not terribly far from where this novel takes place.
mhm.
I think the pronunciation is Chateau, which is on the eastern side of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Probably only a couple hours from Lincoln. But anyway,
Yeah,
Montana's a huge state.
it's massive, and it's I don't it's not something that I'll go out searching for. It's just like one of those funny things
Yeah,
to think about, like these two guys who basically stood for many of the same things,
yeah.
but just completely different paths in their lives. Uh, we we've been going for an hour and a half, and we're not even halfway through
I
the
know,
novella
I know.
because and it's and again short book, but just a lot here.
There's so much, man.
So uh, Tristan goes off adventuring. Right, he's gone for a long time. He gets the Victoria Cross for smuggling weapons into British colonies in Africa, and his father-in-law is it could not be more pissed about this.
Hmm.
He's getting handshakes and backslaps from like all his proper English proper society friends, and he's just seething because this guy isn't treating his daughter well in his estimation. Uh, it gets to the point. We could go another hour and a half just talking about all of Tristan's adventures, but it gets to the point where he writes to uh, Susanna, "Your husband is basically dead. I free you from the marriage," and she goes and marries Alfred. Right. So after a while, Tristan comes home. Right. Uh, Susanna is married to Alfred, and Decker and Pet's daughter, also named Isabel, but nicknamed Two because the mother's name is Isabel. Now that I'm remembering, right?
Hmm.
Her nickname is Two. She's grown up. She's like 16 or 17 at this point, and she has been infatuated with Tristan her entire life.
As all women are.
Yep, yep. And they begin a relationship, and she basically forces him to marry her because she doesn't want to get left behind like his last wife. And he's 100% on board to do this. And I mentioned this earlier because it's important. Like he comes home, he kind of settles down a bit.
Hmm.
He's gotten that adventure more or less out of his system, and he's able to, because he's met the right woman, he's able to slow down, right? So like it's clear to him, and it's clear throughout the book that he and Susanna were not a good match. And because Isabel is part Indian, she's got some of that zest for life that he does as well. He sees her in the same way that he kind of sees himself.
Hmm.
Of course, nothing good can last though. Uh, Tristan decides that life is kind of boring, so he's going to be a bootlegger. He's smuggling Canadian whiskey and across the border just because he wants to, just because it's fun. You know, again, like he's making money hand over fist over this. Meanwhile, his brother is a senator and like an agent of the state, and he's just, you know, he's a criminal, and he's kind of just like leading this uh not criminal empire, but he's leading a gang, guys from his old sailing times help him out, and unfortunately one day he's driving with a bunch of whiskey, and uh a warning shot is fired at the car, but it ricochets and kills Isabel.
Mm-hmm.
uh and here we see again just not only the savagery of Tristan as he just beats into these lawmen, but just the depth of his emotion, the depth of his feeling, the depth of his love for his woman.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, even one stab, who is driving the car at the time, he's mourning as well, which you know is rare for him because again he does have that sort of Cheyenne fatalism, but even this kind of affects him. It's interesting what Harrison does with this. He giveth and taketh away in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, again, though, it's like you sort of know that this is going to happen. You don't know this particular thing is going to happen, of course, and it comes as a bit of a surprise. Like, rereading the scene, I had sort of forgotten how her death happens, and
it's not very explicit.
It's not very explicit. You hear these gunshots, and everything is. There's some heightened tension, but you get the feeling this is all going to be resolved. You know, Tristan is kind of this untouchable force. And so Harrison does this incredible thing earlier in the novel that goes almost, it's so easy to miss. But at one point, very early on, it's describing him leaving to go to Cuba to meet with his father. And one stab presents him with his knife. And there's a paragraph. The following paragraph is that this something like this feeling would extend to the end of Tristan's life, you know, which would end like 60 years later, like in the snowy fields of Alberta, with him like taking down an elk during a hunt or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's literally a parenthetical. But what this so it's this insane kind of transition. I mean, like anybody who's written a story or like tried to write like a novel or something, it's really incredible what he does there. He gives away the entire novel, the end of this guy's life.
Yeah, you don't do that.
You don't do that. It's so weird, and it happens in this parenthetical, and then it's immediately forgotten, and you're transitioning into the next scene. It's a very strange sort of like technical move. But what you know then, always going forward, is no matter what is going to happen to Tristan, and he's in some very hairy circumstances throughout. Like we're going to get to this point where he's at San Francisco and there's this shootout and whatever. We know he doesn't die. Okay. So anytime you get into these moments where he's like bootlegging and he's confronted by these lawmen who sort of shoot their guns in the air, you know he's not going to die. So the tension is sort of undercut, is relieved by this fact. And so you're kind of breathing easy. But then in this case, he like turns, and what we see is that a bullet has gone through his wife's head and killed her instantly. And it's this just unbelievable gut punch, you know.
He knows he's never gonna die,
right?
Or he's gonna live. He's cursed to live a long life.
Yes,
and it's that hubris that he brings to every situation that finally catches up to him in a way that, that hasn't before. You know,
is it hubris? Like, does he bring this on? Sort of. This is like the central tension of the novel, right? Is he in some way responsible for this?
I think he is, because in some way he's following fortune and he's following fate, but at the same time, like he's given several outs to lead a quote unquote normal life.
Yeah.
And he just keeps pushing his chips into the center.
But does he have any like choice in the matter? I mean, is he making is he making choices that imperil these people close to him and that he loves,
I mean, he's
in a
taking
way that's
his
like reckless, or is it in a way that is beyond his control? Like, this is who he is, and anybody who comes into his orbit is doing so under the understanding that they are in proximity to hell, okay, in proximity to like God's wrath.
I think in this instance specifically, and maybe nowhere else in the novel, because this is also this is a turning point for him,
Yeah,
right? That because he's bringing his wife to do crime with him,
yeah,
you know, he's bringing her like they're almost like doing a Sunday drive,
yeah,
but they're just carrying a bunch of whiskey with them, which is illegal at the time. And it's set up that the lawmen have been trying to catch him for a while. So he knows that this is that he's not doing this incognito, And he's
yeah,
not but he's not trying he's so brazen about it that I think that in this it's like he thinks that he's untouchable, but he doesn't consider the consequences for anybody outside of himself in this instance. And then
yeah.
we see a change in him. We do.
Yeah, I want to read this remarkable section where Harrison actually addresses this very question of how we're supposed to interpret the kind of curses and fate that sort of surround Tristan, and the death and suffering and tragedy that follow him where he goes. And so there's going to be another death. I mean, Susanna ultimately kills herself because
She can't be with Tristan.
she can't be. It's insane, like how that unravels too.
She goes nuts, and it's so sad. And
So Harrison, again, this is a remarkable technical sort of moment in the narrative and in the writing, because of he calls out the reader. He like breaks the fourth wall, and he's like speaks to you directly. It's so strange, actually. But he goes, "There's little more to tell. Susanna was buried next to Samuel and the reader, if he or she were a naive believer, might threaten God, saying, 'Leave him alone,' or some such frivolity. No one has figured out how accidental is the marriage of blasphemy and fate. Only a rather old-fashioned theologian might speculate on Tristan damning God so many years before in France, when he and Noel encased Samuel's heart in the paraffin. The contemporary mind views such events properly as utterly wayward, owning all the design of water in the deepest and further reaches of the Pacific." So Harrison almost like tells you how to interpret this, but I think there's even ambiguity here.
oh, totally. He's almost telling you to shut up.
Yeah,
Like
just
just
yeah, yeah. Just
like
let it wash over you. You have to let the mystery wash over you. Like, the deepest reaches of the Pacific is beyond. I mean, this is honestly, this is a Job story. Okay, this is what happens to Job, right? When Job is confronted with the death of his children, and he calls to God for some answer and for some reason about this. God then, appears in the clouds and delivers him this speech. Like, how dare you try to understand my reasoning for doing this? How dare you try to sort of like confront me on questions of fate? And you cannot understand this any more than you can understand like the stars in the sky in the bottom of the ocean. And Job is sort of left speechless, in the presence of this overwhelming mystery. And this is sort of what Harrison is doing to you as a reader. He's telling you to shut up. Stop asking these questions. Just
well,
give yourself over to this mystery.
and it's interesting too because he's also giving away his own culpability here.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
he's like, the reader's saying, "Oh God, please stop torturing this poor man," and Harrison's even saying like, "Listen, I'm not writing this. It is
Yeah.
being written through me, and it
Yeah.
has to come to its proper end."
Yeah.
It's really, and I'm gonna have to look more into Harrison and just like his worldview, especially with what you're telling me about Delva,
Yeah.
because
It's
that's
Alva.
just fascinating to me.
Yeah. It's wild. It's really good. And you see these archetypes again, like the Ludlow character. Dalva's father is very much just a reincarnation of Ludlow, who I think is in many ways Harrison's father. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to look into to those books in particular.
So we skipped over Susanna's story a little bit, and
Uh-huh.
which is fine because I know you're running out of time,
Yeah.
and I've taken you almost 2 hours here, and I
No,
really
this is great,
appreciate it.
man. This is, I love this book. And so, I
But
haven't really ever had a chance to talk about it like this. So I'm happy to.
basically, Susanna is kind of goes bitter and crazy over the fact that she can't have children and that she's no longer with Tristan, and she's gonna kill herself. And Tristan kind of convinces her not to by dangling the possibility that they'll be together again,
Right, right.
which is just like, and again, he's doing this all for Alfred,
Yes.
right? He's doing this because he loves his brother, even though Alfred like pretty much hates him. Um, at the end of the novel, the two brothers are reconciled somewhat because it's kind of left up in the air because Alfred is still a senator. He's still like a an agent of the state, and Tristan is
Yep.
an outlaw.
Yep.
But you even you even have, I think it's Ludlow, right, who kills the agents who
Yes.
come to arrest him.
Well, no. So those guys are the Irishmen,
Oh, right.
the bootleggers from San Francisco, who have tracked him down because Tristan killed his two brothers in Saratoga after they, there's this complicated plot line where they're in San Francisco doing this bootlegging operation, and the Irish mob, essentially, who runs the alcohol trade there, tells them to sort of go away and ends up killing one of their people. And so Tristan, and his lust for vengeance again, um, you know, sort of comes up with this interesting scheme where they end up ambushing the Irishmen, kill a couple of them, and then there's this ongoing sort of cat and mouse game until they eventually end up at the ranch, where yes, Ludlow eventually just dispatches with them. But there's this remarkable scene, okay, where Alfred and Tristan are in this room, at this hotel room, where Tristan is caught with Alfred's wife, and he's doing it for Alfred. He's trying to get Susanna to leave him and see the error in her sort of ways. And Tristan or Alfred sees them and threatens to kill his brother. And so Tristan hands him a gun and says, "Do it." And he's totally sincere. He in fact wants Alfred and to take the opportunity to kill him. And Alfred can't bring himself to do it and sort of collapses on the ground in a sort of a mess of tears. But it's just, again, it's like one of these scenes where as a writer, you're like, how could I possibly convey this without this sounding sort of contrived or melodramatic or like just so terribly maudlin that it just throws the whole thing over? But he just pulls it off. And the way he pulls it off is just by being very matter of fact about the whole thing, just simply describing what happens, I think.
And that's a really effective move for writing. People lament like purple prose, and I sort of have my problems with it here and there as well. Uh, but there's also this other, like, people think that if your writing is too bare,
Mm-hmm.
that it's not interesting. But again, Harrison is a poet,
Mm-hmm.
right? So he knows how to write flowery language. He knows how to paint a picture with words. So when he is leaving a room bare, let's say, or a scene bare, he is doing it so that you fill it in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much to learn from this novella. And I have the collection I have here is 3 different novellas, and I haven't gotten to read the other 2 yet.
Yeah,
But
you should. They're both really interesting in their own way. and they all are about this question of revenge in some way. I mean, Legends of the Fall is the best of them, I think, hands down. And that's, but that's not any way sort of belittling the other two. It's just, this is a kind of remarkable piece of work that any writer would be happy to call their masterpiece, honestly.
Well, Mr. Lomez, I think we're going to end it there. I know that you have to get going,
Yeah.
and I think you left it on a really good note. Where can people find you? How can people support you? Who do you want to shout out?
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
Loma's on Twitter, but Passage Press, help support the cause. We're working on not just publishing older stuff and sort of doing the kind of right-wing publisher thing, but we want new fiction, new novels. We want a place where these kinds of stories and this kind of sophisticated literature can exist, and our sort of legacy publishers aren't delivering on this, and we want to sort of help that cause where we can. So Passage Prize 3 is currently taking submissions. So please, your stories, your essays, your poetry, your art, please send it our way. TR, I expect something from you, man.
When is the submission date?
So right now, March 1st.
March 1st.
So there's
okay.
time. Yeah. So work on something.
I just realized that it's mid-December.
Yeah.
And usually it's January that
we pushed everything back this year. Our schedules kind of moved around because we were so busy with other stuff over the last 12 months.
You guys have been killing it.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Yeah. And so, buy the books, subscribe to Man's World. Yeah. Submit to Passage Prize. And I think that's it. I think those are the things.
Well, thank you, Lomez, for coming on and discussing this amazing work. And thank you out there for listening. And if you'd like to support Canon Fodder, you can subscribe to the Double Dealer Substack. You can buy our next issue. Issue 11 is coming out in December. We also have ways that you can support us via Substack if you so choose. I just want to thank you all again for listening, and I'm going to figure out a way to end this someday. So goodbye.
Thanks, TR.